Good day, beautiful friends, and welcome to Our Power is Within. I'm your host, Chaz Smith, aka Just Chaz, and I am on a mission to inspire people to take their power back and help people to realize that each and every one of us has a healer within our own self. When we can create an environment that supports healing and get out of our own way, we are truly capable of healing in mind, body, and soul. For those of you that are new to the show, welcome. Thank you for being here. And for those of you that have been following along, I also thank you for your continued support and being on this journey with me. If you would like to please help me spread this message, some simple ways to do this are by leaving a review on Apple Podcast or a 5-star rating if you feel I have earned it, and or sharing your favorite episode with a friend or even on your social media. And you can tag me at Our Power is Within on Instagram. Let's dive right into today's challenge. Last week, we practiced interrupting our routine habits, and we did this by practicing driving or walking a different route. So this week, I want us to play again and kind of interrupt old brain patterns by doing something with our non-dominant hand. So let's shoot for a goal of one non-dominant hand task per day, and you can change it up or keep it the same. So some ideas are that maybe you brush your teeth one time per day with your non-dominant hand, or you practice eating one meal per day with your non-dominant hand. Or maybe you want to write one page in your journal or even color a page on a coloring book. As a side note, P.S., children's coloring books are so much more forgiving when you use your non-dominant hand. Just saying. Make it fun, you guys. Let's just have fun with it because fun is such an integral part of life and healing. This week's episode is basically me and our guest shooting the shit about all kinds of random topics related to mind-body syndrome healing. Our guest is Brad Gutting. Brad has his own interesting story of very random back pain that showed up in his body completely at what appeared to be random. And when I say random, I mean he hadn't done anything out of the ordinary physically that would trigger or elicit the back pain or cause a back injury. Brad shares a little bit of detail in his journey and discovery through all of this and healing his back pain. And through the journey of attempting to heal his back pain in all the normal ways that we often first approach pain, he was then somehow led to the work of Dr. Sarno and TMS, otherwise known as tension myositis syndrome, which is mind-body syndrome. And it was through the discovery of Dr. Sarno that he was led down his own beautiful path of growth and expansion. We talk about judgment and the role that it plays in pain. We chat about relationships and the big role that they can play in pain and recovery, and the beauty and the gifts that come through the pain in the end, and so much more. So I hope you enjoy the ride. Brad, welcome to the show, and thanks for being here with me today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
You know, we've talked a lot offline, and I know that I've gotten to kind of learn a little bit about you, but for everyone listening, I was wondering if we could start with a brief overview of just kind of who you are and what you're up to in this world. You could maybe make mention of what brought you into the work you're doing today through the pain experience that you had and how you overcame it.
Sure. I came into TMS back in 2014, and it came out of nowhere. I've been a competitive athlete since 2009. I started working out, I want to say, around 2006, where I got a little bit more serious about being in shape. And there were a couple instances in those years when lifting weights when I might tweak my back or do whatever, something that would immobilize me. But it wasn't until 2014 that I had pain that was bad enough that I wasn't able to work out or even walk and run and do all the things that I used to do. And that was an odd experience because there wasn't any sort of triggering event. I woke up one one morning, and I noticed that my back seemed to be hurting a little bit. And I thought that I could go into the gym and just sort of lift my way through it, which is how I handled it in the past. And that didn't work. And it just progressively got worse to the point where I couldn't even stand comfortably. Uh, I just remember, like about a week into it, we started doing these stand ups every morning at work, or every Monday morning at work, and I was trying to stand up in the literal stand up, and I had to kneel down because I couldn't stand. Um, so this pain that came from nowhere just proceeded to get worse. Nothing seemed to make it better. I went to the rigmarole of chiropractors. Eventually saw a sports medicine doctor who inferred that I had a couple of disc herniations, whatever it was, the L4, L5 herniation. Prescribed physical therapy, did physical therapy for about 3 months. Heard everything from it was sacroiliac joint disorder, displacement, that it was piriformis syndrome, that it was herniated discs, that it was muscle adhesions. One guy told me. Yeah, the point being is that I went through the whole gamut of all the traditional treatments. None of it worked, and I found out about John Sarno's approach on some random blog. Bought the book for $13, and after reading it, what I did is I started reading it, and then I thought if I read the book and then continued with chiropractic and active release technique and these physical therapies, that the combination of those two would resolve this pain and I would get better.
Mm.
That of course didn't work, because you're not you're just reemphasizing and reiterating and reinforcing the physical aspect of it. So reading the book again, Sarno makes it pretty clear that you have to cease all physical therapy, and I had a really hard time reconciling that, but I was desperate enough that I decided that I'd commit to that. And once I did that, within a few weeks I was I was as good as new.
Really? That fast?
It happened quickly. I couldn't, one thing that I tell people is that, like, there's not going to be a day where you realize that you're pain free.
Yeah.
It's like I actually, what I had done is I had a record of when I bought healing back pain in Amazon, and then I had I'd started competing in track cycling pretty seriously a couple years prior to that, and I was sort of amping up my level of commitment to it. And there was a coach that I had been in contact with, and once I was healed and pain free, I contacted him about potentially working together. So I looked at the date that I first emailed him and compared it to when I first started reading the book, and I think it was a total of about 6 weeks that passed.
Mm. Wow, that's awesome. And so within about 6 weeks, you're saying you just had this random day where you were like, you felt ready enough and good enough to call this guy and talk about working
Yeah,
with him.
yeah, I felt ready enough to get back into the gym and start lifting weights again and treat myself as an athlete in the most serious ways.
When you first woke up that day, did you notice, like, okay, so I have a backache? Did you notice your mind trying to connect the dots or figure out a moment in time that something physically happened for it to make sense? Were you like going down that rabbit hole?
Yeah, I was looking for, when the pain hit, I was looking for a physical explanation of it, and it was interesting because it was confusing to me that I didn't do anything on the bike or in the weight room that would have translated into an injury that would have caused pain. Yet it never occurred to me that it would be anything other than physical at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have anything? Because I know this isn't always the case, but often people can look back and be like, oh, well, this was going on in my life around that time. Did you have anything emotional or just anything else in your life?
Even with that, nothing was all that bad. Nothing like it was as ordinary a period of my life as anything else. And I think that's why, well, back in those days, before I discovered Sarno, it never occurred to me. It never occurred to me that this pain would be psychologically created.
Hmm.
That just never entered my mind, and there was nothing that was really going on. I was in a relationship with a doctor. Uh, I had friends. I was riding my bike a lot. I was, work was good. Everything was fine. So there was, if somebody had told me about TMS, 3 days after I first started having back pain, and they said, well, this pain is a function of your repressed rage, I don't know that I would have accepted that
Right.
because I just wasn't seeing it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And you did mention that prior to that back pain, you had other things kind of here and there tweak and happen, but never to keep you down and out long enough.
Right.
And they do say that there's always a whisper and a whisper and a whisper until it gets
Mhm.
like, if you're not catching on and you don't connect the dots, then it has to get louder to get your attention. So that could also, who knows, that could have been what was going on.
That's yeah. I definitely think that is that the whisper turns into a shout at some point.
Yeah, because it's interesting because also it's very normal in our culture when we're in the environments of, we're working out, we're active, we're athletic. It's very normal to have little tweaks or things happen. It's so normal for us to just assume it's because of what we were doing and that it's purely physical without considering that there could be a different component. Like, because why some people can do all the same things and never have any tweaks, and somebody else does all the same things and they have this like tweak and then that tweak and then this happened.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I know for me, I had a lot of whispers before the screams, and then some screams in between.
Yeah.
um, so you read the book. Are you one of the lucky few that just read the book and accepted it to be like, obviously you said the first time you're like, I'm going to do both. And
Yeah,
I
I'm going
can
to do
see that.
both. Right.
I'm going to
Yeah.
do both and double up, and then you realize, nope, that doesn't work. I'm not changing the neural pathways. So when you finally decided to go all in and say, okay, this is me, this is my situation, I'm not going to be afraid anymore, and I'm going to let go of the therapies. Did you do any of Dr. Sarno's like suggestions or practices, or did you just end up feeling better based on the power of the belief and the acceptance?
What did I do? I read a bunch of testimonials that were on the TMS wiki, which were always nice to read because they always made sense. And then what else did I do? There's like a 6 week program on the TMS wiki, and it had some things where you would write out a number of things that you wanted to do, things that might be upsetting to you, things that were going on in your life. I think I stuck with it for like 5 days or something like that. I didn't really commit. I've got a pretty deep skepticism of like specific types of programs, but it was good to do some of these. I treated it like journal prompts. So I did some amount of writing, and then I did a lot of like uh at night before I'd go to bed, I would just sort of lay there and I would think a lot about childhood and spent a lot of time thinking about childhood. I don't think I'd ever dived into that in any real way. Um, and and then started thinking about like anything that was going on in my life presently that might be upsetting. So it was just sort of like an awakening to feelings in a more concerted way. So that was guided by the book, but it was, I did it independently. I wasn't seeing a psychotherapist or anything like that.
But it sounds like even just what you did do brought you to a deeper awareness of what you might actually be feeling. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
I definitely started thinking about my relationships with my parents and with my family and with my girlfriend at the time and just with my friends overall. And that can go, that can go pretty deep, in the sense that I started identifying like a bunch of trivial things or seemingly trivial things from childhood that like I probably held against my parents. And I would kind of go through this process of like, oh, this is silly. How could I be angry about them for this? Like, that's really dumb. And then I'd be like, okay, well, you felt anger about it. That's okay. Like,
Mhm.
and let it pass.
Yeah. So rather than just dismissing it, just accepting that you did.
Yeah, yeah, it's and there's a fine line between dismissing and accepting, and I don't know if I know how to explain it uh, in the best ways. Acceptance, I think, is something that can hang people up. For the longest time, I didn't really understand what it meant to accept something, and then you realize that it's really as shockingly simple as just acknowledging what is and sort of leaving it at that. And
Mm.
not drawing any sort of like extensive conclusions about it. Um, I think that, uh, my parents are very conscientious people and they raised me to be pretty conscientious. And I've always had sort of strong emotions and I've always been pretty good about expressing them pretty clearly and passionately. Um, and they could point out that I was doing that, or they would be worried about what I was thinking or what I was saying when I was expressing how upset I was about some whatever politics, the world, whatever thing. And what I found that sort of led to was a tendency to identify how I was feeling about something as being good or bad, and a lot of I should not feel this way.
Mm.
And that's not acceptance. That's not accepting how you feel. That's actively judging how you feel. And this is a pretty common, easy to miss thing that happens to all of us, that we don't necessarily realize that we're judging ourselves for the feelings that we've got.
Right. Like to be internalizing, there's a internal voice that's saying, well, I should have felt this way, or I should
Yep.
have felt this way, or yeah, that's a really good point. And it's so simple, but so hard often when you're just in your, routine without bringing awareness and presence and knowing into it. You don't even catch it or notice.
Yeah, you don't even catch it. It's
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, because you're so used to this pattern of thinking that there's a right way to feel things and a wrong way to feel things. And if you're doing it the wrong way, then there must be something wrong with you. And you can sort of go off on this chain reaction of tying one feeling to uh, an explanation or some sort of uncomfortable revelation about who you are that leads to other things. And it can just be this sort of ugly cycle.
Mm. Yeah, I see that. How funny. I can totally think of times in my life I've been in that cycle.
Right.
Ugh.
Yeah, it's like and then you get like 10 steps down that cycle and you're really going nowhere with it. It's a totally normal thing to do. Like it's like one thing that when I'm interacting with people is I'm like, look, first thing we're going to do is we're going to get you away from judging yourself. Um, because that's a really insidious sort of automatic default setting that we've got, is to cast judgment on ourselves, particularly if you're a TMS personality type. Um, Self-judgment is just really, really nefarious thing.
Yeah, and it's funny because you briefly mentioned about programs earlier, and it's funny because how reinforcing does that judgment become sometimes when we do enter into some type of program where
Right.
now we feel we should have to do these things absolutely perfect, or we're once again judging ourselves.
Right. That's
Yeah.
programs can be great in the sense that they sort of set a nice framework for taking actions. But at the same time, what I've also seen people do is like, well, they try and start a program and then a day or two pass and they just don't feel like doing anything with it, which is completely fine. But then all of a sudden, well, I'm off track and I'm not sticking to the program. Like, well, yeah, that's the whole thing. Is now you set up another dimension on which you can judge yourself.
Right. Yeah. The not good enough,
Right.
failure, sabotage, all that stuff. Yeah.
The odds of somebody with TMS having a bit of a perfectionist personality are pretty high. And so it's like, now you've just found something else to be a perfectionist about.
Yep. Absolutely. I have that experience too. And then I had to like go back, and though I had so many benefits following a program, I had that one lingering thing, that perfectionism, that like, oh, if you don't do this perfect, and at what point do you get to break out of that cycle and that mindset? So you have to, kind of back up and say, okay, I need to now actually create a new story that says that I don't actually need to do this perfect
Right.
forever.
So you still, you still have to take a pretty active role here. You have to express some amount of initiative in order to get anywhere with this. So, on the one hand, I'm saying it's like, yeah, I'm a little skeptical about like, strict programs and buying into one set of principles versus another set of principles. I mean, do what you want, do what you will, whatever works for you. I'm sure, I can have some, I can express some skepticism about that, but I can also say it's just like, if you don't make an effort to change the way that you're thinking, which means identifying and understanding your thought patterns and how they connect to your behaviors and how those behaviors then reinforce those thought patterns, you're going to be stuck in that loop. So you still have to cut the loop, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I get that. So what, so you're feeling better about 6 weeks. You call this guy for this track cycling. At that point, though, did you still implement? And I know you didn't have any specific things, but were you still bringing awareness? Was that like a catalyst that kind of changed how you approached life and your own feelings and assessing and just being conscious of where you're at emotionally?
Yeah, it was a total shift. All of a
Okay.
sudden, I was just like way more like any of the practices that I picked up about like thinking about how I uh, was engaging with my feelings. I was just, yeah, consistently, almost daily, probably reflecting in some way before I went to bed or just when I had a few free moments. Like I wasn't doing any sort of like really, really formalized meditation at that point. Um, but I was consciously aware as well as I could from that point on. And when I went back into the gym, because of course, like resuming normal physical activity is something that we tell you to do. I took a pretty, I still took a graded exposure to it. Like I was pretty slow and deliberate about like putting weight on the barbell, and I was fine with that. It was, it took me, it felt like I was moving really slow, but I think within about 3.5, 4 months, I was squatting over 300 pounds for sets of five, which in the grand scheme of things it's not that long a period of time.
Mhm.
So the patience was really good to have, to have taken sort of a patient approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a great quality to just implement in life in general. So it probably kind of spilled over into your life,
Yeah,
just.
yeah, I've definitely gotten more. I feel like I've gotten more patient over time, which is a really useful skill to develop. I don't think I intentionally tried to develop it, but uh, I think that I used to live in a state of constant immediacy where I just, I felt like if I wasn't doing something that I was wasting time.
Mm.
And for the most part, I've kind of let that pass. Like living in the Pacific Northwest, if it's a particularly good day outside for mountain biking or skiing, I don't want to miss it. But, sometimes I do miss it. And so it goes, right?
Yeah, totally.
like, there will be another day. Like, okay.
Do you feel like that shift then, that moment where your back hurt and everything you went through to overcome the back pain, do you feel it was like a catalyst in kind of changing just overall the trajectory of your life and just how you interacted and approached life?
Completely. And yeah, completely. It's one thing for me to say that now from this vantage point. I do know that like things changed in terms of like how certainly how I was engaging with my feelings overall. But yeah, that it started a different trajectory, which has continued to grow. Um, so I think I'm probably, almost 7 years removed from the experience of, the original like 8 month long back pain or whatever it was. Um, I'm more sophisticated in how I think about this stuff now, and that started with reading Sarno and reading Steve Ozanich and all that, and getting past the back pain. Yeah, that something switched, and it's just continued to grow over time.
How awesome. It's like hard when we're in it to understand that the pain can be a gift, but down the road, we usually often see that, it's a huge catalyst that only helps us to align to our actual like path of authentic living.
That's the thing, and without having experienced the pain, uh, I think I'd probably feel. I feel a much greater sense of like, I don't know if control is the right way, but I feel a much better sense of like peace and contentment overall. Overall, I mean, this does not mean that I'm in a perpetual state of ease and enlightenment by any means, but when I have bad feelings or bad days, I'm more acutely aware that they too will pass, and my awareness of the impermanence of everything is really on point.
That's awesome. It's a good skill to have too.
It's like anything else. You got to be patient with yourself and just sort of let it develop as it develops. I don't think there's anything special about me or anything special about what I did.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's just consistency and just like you said, being patient and being aware.
Yeah, and I mean that sort of daily awareness. We talk about this all the time, and nowadays, particularly, mindfulness is like, it's an element of commercialization. I mean, it's pretty widespread. Back in 2005, uh, I surprised my sister at her graduation from Kenyon College. I wasn't originally going to be able to go, and then my little brother talked me into like flying up to Columbus, Ohio, and he would pick me up from the airport and take me into Gambier, where Kenyon was. And so showed up, surprised my sister, and we had a great time. And then the next day was the graduation ceremony, and at that graduation ceremony, David Foster Wallace gave this unbelievable commencement speech that has since become it's become part of popular culture to an extent. It's called the "This is Water" speech. And he starts his speech off talking about how, he literally just launches into it like very, very informally. And he starts talking about how there are these two young fish swimming along in the water one day. And as they're swimming, they come across an older fish swimming in the opposite direction. He says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And the fish sort of nod in response, and they continue going down their way. And a few minutes later, one of the young fish turns to the other and says, "Dude, what the hell is water?" And spends the rest of the next 20 minutes talking about how easy it is to miss the completely obvious, and how difficult it is to actually be consciously aware day in, day out. And it is, like one of my critiques of this sort of obsession with mindfulness is that like that it can sort of lead to this obsession with like mindfulness advice and spending your time on Pinterest motivational boards, and all of a sudden all you're thinking about are like, concepts and philosophies regarding mindfulness, as opposed to just like existing in the world and spending your time there and being aware of like what's actually happening to you or around you or just in general.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's funny because you actually heard that speech by David Foster Wallace.
Yeah, I was there.
Oh,
Yeah, I was
how
there.
funny! Because I don't know who he is. I've never heard his name, but I've seen so many memes of the fish and
Yeah,
that comment.
that's where it comes from. Yeah, it
How
was one of those things when you were there. Like, I think the younger, the students themselves. I think they responded positively to the speech, but there was one point where he was talking about the banalities of day in, day out, and he's like, none of you who are, none of you graduating seniors have any clue what that actually means, because you haven't lived long enough to do it. So there was some disconnect there, but you could see the parents just like across the board were were responding to it with this sort of like knowing resignation. It was an interesting sight to see.
That's funny. Okay, so speaking of like mindfulness and just rituals or practices,
Yeah.
do you have anything that you still implement in your day to day life now, or like as needed?
Periodically meditation. What I had been doing meditation in a more concerted form. I know he's kind of a controversial dude at this point, but Sam Harris, who's a neurologist, he has a pretty scientific approach to meditation that I really, really liked, because it's very simple and it was guided. I had been doing on this sort of unguided stuff for a while, and that was fine. But when I picked up Harris's program, I did that for about a month, and it took me a little while to get through it actually because I didn't do it every day. But what was great about it was that it taught these principles that I found that I could just sort of incorporate into normal day to day living. That I didn't necessarily feel like I had to set aside 10 minutes every day to meditate. I don't think that there was anything wrong with that necessarily. It's just that for me, the principles resonated well enough that I found that I was sort of like almost unconsciously implementing them, on a day to day basis, sort of like a waking meditation or something.
Yeah, and what were they?
Oh, what were the principles? Let's see. Paying a lot of attention to my breathing, actually, and just sort of being aware of sounds and senses. Um, I could do it like in these like little microscopic intervals of time. I can sit in a quiet room and sort of listen to the sound of traffic outside, and listen to sounds sort of coming and going. I can focus on the sensation of my breath. Sometimes I focus on my chest and my torso. Sometimes I focus on the tip of my nose. I just sort of pick things randomly like that. Very, very basic things. And in terms of what it does, the effect that it has is it just sort of, I don't know, it just makes me aware of how much exists just in consciousness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's totally awareness and mindfulness incorporated in little bouts throughout your day,
Yeah.
which, in a sense, that's the goal, right? Like, it's the goal's not to be mindful for a 10-minute meditation and then go out and live
Yes.
on autopilot. The goal is to bring that awareness back into the present moment as often as possible.
Yeah. And it's really good with emotions because I can have a feeling hit me. Like I can peruse Twitter. It's a great arena for triggering yourself. It's- and I can find something and I can have an intensely sharp emotional response to it. I can feel it and I think about like how it feels in my muscles and how it feels in my heart and how it feels in my throat and whatever. And I can feel that, and there can be an overwhelming urge to reconcile it in some active type of way in terms of like, do I want to yell? Do I want to write something and send it to somebody? Do I want to like do something that is going to cause a response to somebody else? Or or can I recognize that just as with everything else, the emotion will come and then it will eventually pass. And every time it eventually sort of eases up and resolves. And being aware of that has been fantastic because I don't feel like my emotions rule me, but I also don't feel like I'm disconnected to how I feel.
Right. It's a balance.
Very much.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can totally think, yeah, it's, I can relate to this. Like for me, scrolling like Facebook or something, especially in the last year.
In the last year, it's the sharpness that I've seen people interact with each other with online has been it's been distressing to see. Uh, I
Yeah.
remember I posted something on Facebook a couple months ago. I was like, "And what did we learn from the global pandemic?" Because I like to be snarky and kind of a troll, and not. a cynical troll, but I genuinely wanted to see what people were going to say. And there was a proliferation, a lot of responses about just how stupid and awful and selfish everybody is. And it's like, well, I understand that. I also choose not to draw that as the only lesson or even the lesson or even a lesson from what this is. I think I drew other conclusions from this experience. Um, Namely that people have an incredible need to connect with each other and have meaningful relationships, and that those relationships need more dimension than what a screen can afford.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good um, perspective.
I try.
And this is actually a good kind of tie in, actually, because you and I
Yeah.
offline talked a bit about relationships and the role that they play in our well-being. And you
Yes.
mentioned you think that to be aware of our relationships is so important in our journey. And so could you give some thoughts on that for everyone listening? Just, yeah, relationships. What
Yeah.
does it mean?
Relationships. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's fair to start about that broadly too. So some years ago, I read about uh, a longitudinal study that had been conducted called the Grant Glueck study. I think it was done out of Harvard, and it's been going on for 70, 80 years at this point. So you've got a lot of longitudinal data starting from the very beginning to the present day. And what they were effectively trying to track was what made for a happy and fulfilled life. And so they kept up with these people, mostly men at the beginning. I think it's expanded beyond that. You know, Harvard and other institutions were not exactly known for their focus on diversity and equity back in the days, but I think that's changed. At least it seems to be somewhat. And with their efforts to understand what made people happy and fulfilled, had very little to do with how much money they made or the sort of jobs that they had or where they lived or any of that. It almost always came down to the warmth of the relationships that they had with other people. And those relationships could be family relationships with their immediate family, with their children, or it could just be with having really good quality friendships and connections with others. And I thought about that and I thought, well, this has been going on for a long period of time. People have paid a lot of attention to that. This seems to make sense. It certainly makes sense to me. So I'm going to focus a lot on the relationships that I have. And that's going to be really important. So that's my baseline is that good relationships are critical in order for you to feel like you're living a really good life. So I'm less concerned with, what sort of great things are you going to do? What sort of accomplishments and achievements will you have? I don't think that those things mean all that much in the long run if you don't have people that you deeply care about and who deeply care about you. So that begs the next question. What constitutes a good relationship and how do you wind up having them? That's not an easily answered question by any stretch. Um, so I think that a sense of or willingness, desire to share yourself with other people, share how you feel, and to listen to and accept how they feel is sort of like foundational to it. And then there's a lot that goes beyond past that, but there's a huge emotional component to it. It's not a matter of like function and utility. Like it's not a matter of like what do I get out of having this person in my life, as much as it's what do we share together.
Hmm. Yeah. So many of us go into relationships, though, focused on what we're getting out of it.
And that I think is a dead end. Like I candidly, I think that I think that that turns it into strictly a transactional relationship, which is the opposite of a warm, caring relationship.
Yeah. And that might explain why there's such a high divorce rate,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. I All I know about high divorce rates is that high divorce rates are a thing. In terms of why, I have no idea.
Yeah, probably millions of reasons.
Yeah, tons of reasons, right? Yeah.
But, so what's your advice in terms of when you have somebody who does have some type of chronic pain or illness and they're trying to heal? It sounds like relationships will be something that you're going to want to address.
I think and keep in mind, relationships can also be the source of why you're having a lot of chronic pain.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, oh man, that's where it's tough, right? Because we don't want to get you into a habit of like saying like, oh, okay, I have a difficult relationship with this person, therefore they are quote unquote toxic, therefore I have to remove them from my lives. In many cases, that is absolutely the case. If you're involved in anything that is remotely abusive, then that is toxic, and you don't have to, and you should not take responsibility for that person's behavior. So setting some of those boundaries, is going to be really important, and it's probably a good idea to work with a psychotherapist uh, who can help you work through that and identifying those patterns and what to do about it. But if that's not the case, if you're not dealing with something that's like intensely traumatic, um, then I kind of go back to the acceptance vector and pursuing that route. So it's like, okay, there are very high odds that you harbor some amount of anger or resentment towards your parents. Everybody does this, and there's nothing wrong with it. Getting to the point of being able to say that there's nothing wrong with it is not an easy thing to do. So much of the repressed anger that causes TMS pain is anger that is rooted in something that feels inescapable or obligatory, something that you cannot get away from. This is why it's not uncommon for a lot of young parents or parents of young children to deal with TMS pain, because there's can be a lot of frustration that comes with raising young kids, and you might feel an incredible amount of guilt or shame about feeling frustrated about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And the flip side is, I know firsthand also, if you kind of deal with that, if you're the child, an adult child with a parent, you might feel like resentment or anger, but
Mm-hmm.
yet you might have like a decent relationship today, and then then you're accompanying that anger, resentment with guilt, because you're like, well, I love you today, but I still
Right.
feel these like harsh feelings, so now I kind of feel guilty about it.
Right. And so this is like, so you can take relationships with parents, and you can say, oh, I did some digging and I found that I was really angry about my parents for the way that they treated me when I was 4 years old in regards to this one thing. Pick one. There's tons of examples if you really look for them. And then what you want to do is you kind of want to be able to say like, okay, I felt angry, and cut it off there, rather than go down this potentially destructive path where you start inventing reasons for why your parents did what they did and assigning intentions and values to them that they may not have had at all. Um, I remember it was. It occurred to me one day is that like I feel a lot happier when I don't assign intentions to other people, when I don't presume to know exactly why they're doing what they're doing. Because if I start thinking that I understand with a hell of a lot of certainty why they made decisions that they had, that's going to make me miserable. Because rarely are those intentions that I assign to other people good. And it's always something about their selfishness or their short sightedness or whatever. And that, that will make you more pissed off. So I just decided I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm like, okay, somebody did something I don't know exactly why. I should probably try and understand that if it's that important to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, we have that negativity bias in our brain, so it's pretty natural that we're
Sure.
just gonna automatically like assume the worst or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of good evolutionary reasons why we had that. I mean that comes from a logical place, right? Before we lived in a prosperous, overly safe society, we did not live in a society at all. So there was a lot more danger. So, the mental patterns that emerged and that survived are ones that took potentially negative signals very seriously. So that's something that seems to be hardwired into us. But that doesn't mean that we can't overcome it. It's just that in order to overcome it, we should probably be aware that it's something that happens.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Again, the awareness.
Awareness
Yeah.
solves a lot, but you know, you're never going to be aware of everything all the time. So,
No, no, we can just do our best. So, if you had somebody who is kind of that in between, they're not in their relationship is causing a lot of, turmoil,
mhm.
strife, stress, but it's not necessarily that the other person, they're not in a abusive or a they're not with a toxic person per se. They're just in a relationship that has lost its way.
Yeah, any
What do
normal
you
relationship.
yeah, what do you say for like what are people's steps to take, like if they're trying to heal and recover, what are their steps to take in addressing that relationship if it's not one that they're going to close the door on?
I am in favor of developing as much mental and emotional autonomy as you can. Um, I think that makes for stronger relationships when you have, basically, when you own your shit, so to speak, which is not a statement that I would necessarily make to somebody who is chatting with me. I wouldn't say like, "Well, you just need to own your shit," but that is sort of the outcome, and you kind of want to be able to get to the point where you can be that blasé about saying it, because I find that sort of a healthy place to be, where you're just not taking it too seriously, where you're not, there are times when we don't want to have to take responsibility for what's going on in our lives. That's completely normal. Nobody craves additional responsibility automatically. But frequently, I think what happens in relationships is that it's easy to look at the person that you're with. It's like, okay, we're in a relationship, so that means we solve each other's problems. um, Maybe not. Would that be the case? um, Not that a partner shouldn't, or friend, whatever the nature of the relationship is, not that there shouldn't be an element of support to it. There absolutely should. That was kind of my whole point, is that like you have relationships so that you can share with each other and support each other, but the more control you feel over what's going on in your life and the thing, how you respond to what happens and what you choose to do in response to it, the more that you're able to determine those things yourself, uh, the more present I find that you can be in a relationship, because you're not offloading your problems to someone else and asking them to take on more than they might be able to. They might be dealing with more shit than you are, for instance.
Yeah, and also just not having somebody else be responsible for our happiness and contentment.
Well, yeah, it's just as a general rule. I think that sort of like one's own happiness is really one's own responsibility, and that's a tricky thing to say, because it's just, there are a lot of unfair circumstances, and life is, generally speaking, not a particularly fair thing, and that sucks, right? Like, there's a lot of unfairness and a lot of bullshit out there, uh, and it's not totally cool to say like, yeah, well, life sucks, get a helmet, right? Uh, but at
Get
the same
helmet.
time, in a battle between right, like, you don't want to be callous about it, but we got to be realistic. In a battle between you and the rest of the world, probably bet on the rest of the world, if you're going to choose to see things in that sort of conflict. So, the point being is that, like, you wanting the rest of the world to be different than the way it is admirable, probably, but it is not sufficient for it to actually happen. So, circumstances being what they are, you accept those. And this goes back to that old cliche about accept that which you cannot control, right? And when you sort of identify, I can control this and I cannot control that, fine. That's not a bad place. That's a pretty good place to arrive at, because this is going to be an ongoing theme. Is that, like, generally speaking, life is, can frequently be one catastrophe after the next, and we're just trying to survive it. I mean, life is difficult. Life can be very tough, and knowing that life can be very tough, having the tools and sort of the resilience in place in order to just navigate it, and know that you'll be able to get through it, can go a long way towards your own sense of fulfillment and happiness. Um, that does not necessarily mean that you look at the unfairnesses and injustices in the world and say, well, okay, there's nothing I can do about them. It doesn't matter anyway. That's no good. And that doesn't do you any good. Um, but recognizing, if you choose to take a path where you want to make changes, recognizing that it can take a long time and not exactly be a linear process, not a bad place to arrive, right? I mean, anything worth doing can take a long time and require a lot of effort. So anything that gets you to stick with it is probably going to be a, a happier result.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. And when I like, what the word that comes to mind for me is reciprocation too. When I think of
Mm, yeah.
relationships and then healing, I think there's a good chance that if you're doing some type of work to bring awareness into your life and discernment and consciousness, that you're probably, as you're healing yourself, you're probably going to see that carry over into healing your relationships to some degree. I can't imagine that somebody who grows in awareness and consciousness doesn't have impact in their relationships.
Yeah.
And the flip side is, if you I can't imagine that as you're healing your relationships and bringing more wholeness into them and fulfillment, that you're not also going to notice in a shift in your own self.
And certainly that's what happened for me. My relationships overall have become tremendously deeper and stronger than before I learned about TMS. Not that my relationships or friendships were bad or empty before then. It's just that I feel a level of depth and engagement that I had not before. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've got, it's not that I have like tons and tons of friends, or, that sort of thing. But I have a number of friends whom I am able to just sort of candidly talk about how I feel, and they can tell me how they feel. So I've got a number of friends in mountain biking. It's a big thing around the Seattle area. And, it's those are more than just riding buddies. It's not just a fun thing that we do. We do things together, and being able to have real conversations is is pretty freaking great.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I would say, like, as sad as this is, it's worth noting that you're, as a man, it's, I think, generally often harder for men to find those friends that they can actually talk about their emotions and how
Yep.
they're feeling, and be deep with each other. So that's really awesome.
Yep. Men typically suck at making friends. Uh, it's just one of those things where there are a lot of dudes who just don't really know how to have an actual friendship, as opposed to somebody who's just kind of like an activity buddy, somebody that you go drinking with or somebody you do stuff with. But some of the coding that we've assigned to various gender identities is, when you look back at it, we're more enlightened about it now. But when you look back at older history, just how critical culturally we could be about men expressing their feelings, it just looks barbaric. Like, it looks so primitive, you know. Just the sort of tendency to associate emotional expression with weakness. Very strange. Very
Yeah.
strange.
But
It's
there's a
gotten
shift
better lately.
happening.
There
Yeah.
is, and it's tricky because at the same time we don't want people like just like constantly talking about how they're feeling. Like,
No.
it's an aspect, but I would say that overall my general philosophy towards life and living is to live it and to spend time doing it and to again, if you choose the route of pursuing great achievements and accomplishments, I think that's fine. I certainly nothing that I would criticize. If you don't care about that stuff, you shouldn't feel about it either. I think there's been a growing push to sort of embrace a quote unquote mediocre life. And of course, to that I would counter, well, what do you mean by mediocre? Because I think that a life spent with good friends, having good times on whatever level you choose those to be, that sounds like a pretty fantastic life. Even though you may not necessarily be starting companies or creating great works of art or healing diseases or doing these big grandiose things. If you don't do that, I think that that's fine. I think that a great life has many different dimensions to it.
Oh, absolutely. And the key point that you made, that it's funny you said it, because oh my gosh, I just totally agree, is you said life is meant to be like spent living.
Yeah.
And how you said, we just can't sit around and talk about our emotions all day, which is so true. And it goes back to everything else that like sometimes we find ourselves so ill, in so much pain or dis-ease, that it's almost like it becomes like our entire purpose of living becomes just focused on healing. And we
Right.
forget to still say yes to living, which,
Yeah.
like all these other things, there's a reciprocation so often in saying yes. And I get it. Like sometimes I've been there where you can be so ill or debilitated that you can't say yes to everything that you would want to. But there becomes a point where, as we're feeling better and getting better, that we want to start finding that balance of living. And I really like how you also, like, something that really resonates with me is the fact that you are incorporating mindfulness in your living, right? Like, instead of
Yes.
having to set aside hours every day to do all these things to be mindful or aware, you're living and bringing it into the living element.
Yeah. I follow a certain amount of structure and routine, albeit pretty loose, but there is at least some there, kind of. Um, like I think that there are probably some people who'd really benefit from setting aside 10 to 15 minutes at any given point of day consistently to sit down and meditate in whatever fashion they choose. That's probably not a bad thing at all. Um,
No.
but if that doesn't work for you, fine. I would still strongly advise like probably getting into some meditation to learn some of these techniques so that you can practice them a little bit more regularly. It is worth taking on some structure and discipline for periods of time.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have and I mean, because the change happens in the repetition. So we have to like have
Yeah.
something to help us learn how to integrate this into our living. I mean, chances are if I was never mindful or aware, I'm not just going to be doing it perfectly or like all the time without practicing it.
Yeah, by no means would that be the case. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. And then there's like the integration too, the balance of, just like you said, when you first started going back into the gym, you did graded exposure and you rebuilt that tolerance in that capacity. And I think that's a big thing too for people as they're reintegrating back into life is, taking the baby steps that they need.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really key, I think. Um, it's Jordan Peterson, who I know pisses some people off, but I don't mind him necessarily. One thing that when you look at Peterson's approach to living, he starts very small. This notion of stand up straight with your shoulders back and clean your room and that sort of stuff. And the reason why he does that is like because frequently what hangs people up is that they think that they have to get to the destination immediately. And frequently, that destination they want to get to, first off, it doesn't really exist because nothing is ever that static in life. Secondly, the direction that they want to move in or the place that they want to arrive is so big and so complex that there's no way that it would happen immediately. So he tells people, he's like, well, don't aim so high. You need to aim lower and do smaller and smaller things consistently. And over time, those accumulate and they build up. And this applies to an awful lot of things that you might want to do in your life too.
And who is he?
Oh, Jordan Peterson is a Canadian psychologist who sort of toiled in obscurity in academia for decades. He wrote a book in I think the late 1990s called Maps of Meaning, which like this did this like incredibly convoluted, complex analysis of how people architect meaning in their lives, and like nobody really read it.
Mhm.
But it was, it was interesting. And then he started responding to people's questions on Quora about life advice, and somebody found him, and like a book agent found his answers, and they said, would you consider writing a book about this stuff? And so he's like, sure, that sounds great. And he wrote this book called 12 Rules for Life. Uh, and it published, and a lot of people really liked it, and a lot of people really did not like it.
Hmm.
It's, I'll leave it at that. I have my own opinions about him and some of his thinking, and sort of what happens when a public intellectual gets a little bit too much attention. Maybe there's some good ideas. There's some things that probably warrant a little bit more interrogation than they get, but uh, it's some of the basic fundamental common sense things that he talks about are really worth reviewing. I think a lot of the advice that I would give, a lot of the advice that's out there that tends to be the most useful, can often be dismissed as stuff. It's like, well, that's really basic, or that just sounds like common sense. True, I would say that is definitely the case. But if you look at anybody who is really, really great at anything, any sort of like if you take a great basketball player, they spend an awful lot of time on their fundamentals. Never underestimate the importance of fundamental things.
I 100% agree with you. Even as a coach myself in the fitness realm for so
Yeah.
long,
Yeah.
I would constantly remind people that we are never above the basics.
Never,
Ever.
never.
Never. We're never too good to go back to the basics.
It's just like I've been lifting weights for a long time. Every set that I do for every exercise, I start with an empty barbell, and I treat that barbell as if it had 400 pounds on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the fitness world, yeah, in weightlifting, it's if you treat the light bar like it's heavy, it helps the heavy bar feel light.
Exactly. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit for us. And I know that you do actually coach now people who are kind of like in the TMS realm or might
Yeah.
have TMS pain. Um, is that your full time job? Is that what you
No,
do?
no,
Or
no,
is
no.
it?
I'm a tech guy. I
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a product designer at a Series D startup in Seattle.
Oh,
So
okay. So you coach for more of a hobby on the side.
it's a hobby because I like being involved in this world. So I moderate the TMS, the Mind Body Syndrome Facebook group, which has, oh geez, well over 3,000 members at this point. I think when I took the group on, it had about 1,500. So it's grown quite a bit, and through that, I'll connect with people, um, and work with them in whatever capacity they're comfortable with. Phone calls, video calls, sometimes just emailing, and
Okay.
talk about things. I intentionally don't want to be a full time coach because I don't want to rely on something like that for income. Because generally speaking, my thinking with this is that I would prefer that people be able to just have one or two conversations with me and then feel like they're centered enough and clear enough about what approach they're going to take uh, to get through the pain that they're dealing with.
Right. And so, how would you describe your style of coaching?
Well, it's I can be a combination of very attentive but pretty blunt. Um, I don't like. I'm not interested in being provocative just for the sake of it, but I want to avoid getting into a cycle of just listening and giving affirmations. First off, I'm not formally a psychotherapist, so I would never bill myself as such. Um, my approach is to uh, get you to some level of comfort with the fact that you have emotions, uh, and not judging yourself. So just being able to listen is good in that regard. And then to sort of like just sort of point out some of the realities of getting through TMS, which aren't necessarily obvious. So it can be really helpful to talk to somebody about, like, I've got TMS, I'm totally convinced of it, but like, what the hell does this even mean? Like, where is this going to wind up going? Because consistently what we find is that, like, the healing process itself is not a linear thing. You don't read the book and then gradually get better every day thereafter, right? It's usually a lot of up and down, and it's because of those difficult periods when you think that you should be getting better, that can really throw you off. So being a bit of an objective voice and sort of a quote unquote sanity check is sort of the role that I try to play first and foremost. And then, if I'm talking to somebody who I really think needs a more professional therapeutic approach, then I refer them accordingly to somebody who's going to be a much more capable therapist than I would be. Not everybody I find necessarily needs that. Some people just need somebody who's going to like talk to them straight and listen for more than 2 minutes.
What would be an indicator if you're having a conversation with someone? What would be some indicators or cues that would lead you to believe that they might be somebody you need to refer out?
Anything that suggests pretty severe big T trauma uh, goes beyond what I would say that I'm qualified to do. And what I found is that, like, not everybody's going to, some people will flat out tell you that they've dealt with traumatic experiences. Not everybody will. So if there might be certain patterns of behavior that I see in how somebody's talking about what's going on that might lead me to believe that something happened. Um, Frequently, this can be when I see people have like some really, really severe trust issues. That can often be a cue that there's been some sort of abuse that's occurred. And at that point, if I'll ask if they've sought professional psychotherapy, and if they haven't, if they would consider getting some for it.
Okay. And do you have kind of like your go-to people that you refer out to?
Well, the thing with psychotherapy is that you've got to be licensed in a given state. So I know a number of psychotherapists that I interact with on Twitter who I think are great, but they might only be licensed in a couple, in one or two states. So it's the beauty of the American healthcare system is somebody is still going to have to kind of go through the rigmarole of uh, going through the process of finding people who are licensed in their actual state, which is usually not an easy process. Big
Mm,
surprise.
yeah. And so, what would be like if somebody was listening? What would be kind of like a good indicator that you would be like the right fit for them? Like, what would they be looking for if they wanted to reach out to you?
I what I tend to be best at is people who are familiar with TMS, but for the life of them are stuck in a cycle where the symptoms just keep coming back, where it feels like it's a sort of never-ending type of thing, where they're aware of the principles and they're just feeling really, really stuck. because when you're at the point of feeling really, really stuck, I feel like my style of talking, which is going to be pretty direct and uh, very to the point in terms of saying like, okay, like it would not be common or not, it would not be uncommon for me to be chatting with somebody who's kind of in this point of being stuck in the TMS cycle of being like, what are all the reasons why you think that you would not want to heal? And
Mm.
which sounds a little confrontational, but it's also something that I've seen people respond to just fine because then they have to think like, well, okay, what am I getting out of being in pain and having symptoms all the time? Because you can get something out of that, right? And uh, I can remind you that like these symptoms in and of themselves are not dangerous things. You know, they're not indicative of a physical or structural abnormality. And because of that, we don't have to treat this pain with a whole lot of respect because it's just kind of fucking with you. And so that's why I think that like if you have not been getting really direct style of feedback, that's something that I can provide because I'm not going to be, again, I'm not going to be direct just for the sake of being provocative or difficult or doing what Eddie Lindenstone has often called tough love. You know, the sort of tough love approach. It's like, well, I don't. It might look like that on the surface, but it's not meant to be tough necessarily. It's meant to be like, I don't want to indulge in excessive empathy because that can leave you stuck in patterns that aren't what you want, that are not going to lead to any sort of change. And uh, I like to be able to sort of break that cycle. And so the reason why I can be blunt and direct is coming from a place of compassion and a desire to see you heal and to get past whatever difficulties you're having.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, I mean, we all need different things from some time, at different times. I mean, I think it's even in the Unlearn Your Pain by Dr. Schubiner. He said, like, the first like week, he says, if you have to, like, you basically yell at your brain and tell
Yeah.
it, would you just stop, but then over the weeks, he takes you into, okay, now let's actually try to hold compassion and
Yep.
like talk nicely and soothingly. And so it's knowing that it's not just necessarily one way that will work all the time, but like, I mean, I know that I've had moments where I've had to be so sweet and loving and talk to
Oh
my
yeah.
brain and myself so kindly. And then there's been times where I'm like, cursing and just saying like, this is fucking enough.
Yeah.
And it works, in those moments. It's just, there's a balance.
Yeah, there's a balance, and like it's some people can get through this themselves, and that's great if they can. I definitely applaud that. But what can be helpful about talking to somebody like me is that I can, I've got a better sense of like, okay, what is it that you're actually likely to respond to in a meaningful way? And sometimes some people are just like excessively harsh on themselves. And so like they don't need somebody else to be like really harsh and blunt with them.
Yeah.
They need somebody to be like, no, no, like here's how you do understanding. And this is why it's okay and not a sign of weakness. Um, but then some people just like, okay, you're spinning, you are engaging in the same patterns over and over again. You're not linking it to what lack of progress is coming from this. You need to stop it. So we're going to talk about what are some ways that maybe you can change your thinking here. How can we get you to think differently about your thinking for a little bit? But
Totally.
it's just a matter of being able to sort of see what's going on. So, like, I mean, like anybody else, I want to listen to how you're feeling and what's on your mind and what's going on. I don't have a one fits all approach beyond that. Um, it is shocking at times how many people have very few options to get anybody to just listen to them, you know?
Mm.
And when you start with getting a sense of how people are feeling right now and what's going on, um, that can go a long way. Somebody posted something on the Facebook group last night, um, dealing with some symptoms sort of coming out of nowhere, typical type of thing. And I was like, well, this could probably be TMS, and nothing to suggest that it wouldn't be. And I said, but forget all of that. What's going on with you? And he said, oh, it's just really the usual stuff. And I was like, well, the thing about that response is when somebody says like nothing unusual is going on, is that reminds me of me in 2014 when I started dealing with back pain that didn't go away in the first place. It was just the usual stuff that was going on. And frequently what that is the usual stuff is just code for there's some shit that's really pissing me off. I don't really know if I fully understand it, but I feel like I'm completely wrong in feeling this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
again, so simple, but can be so complicating.
yeah, it's really interesting how that works. Is that like, there's a level of complexity to this, sure, but frequently there's something really really simple. It's just that like, look, when you're repressing anger, that really means that you're not aware that you're doing it, and the reasons why you may not be aware of it is because first off, you could have been conditioned for decades not to really think about why you might feel angry about things, and secondly, that judgment again, that you shouldn't feel angry about what's going on. Well, I've got this in my life, and things would be so much worse, and like I don't really have anything legitimate to complain about. Like all of those are completely invalidating statements, and we do it all the time. And that's the
Yep.
sort of stuff that we bundle up into like the usual.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it takes somebody else to help us see these blind spots.
Yep.
Yeah. And you're right. I can understand how some people would probably come and say that they don't feel just like heard or they're just listened to, because I mean, especially when you are the professional, a lot of times you want to be able to, like, you want to have the answers. You want to give people advice.
Right.
Sometimes they just need to be heard.
Yep. Frequently, they just need to be heard. Yep.
Yeah. So where can people find you and connect with you?
Facebook is the way I do it. I don't have a website. I'm pretty passive about this actually. So the TMS, the mind body syndrome, is the group that I moderate. Eddie Lindenstein is technically the administrator of it. So we both kind of handle it. And I just usually have people reach me through there. And the reason why I say that is because the way that we operate that group is that there are membership questions that you have to answer in order to join. And one of those membership questions is, have you read books by John Sarno, Steve Ozanich, Nicole Sachs, Howard Schubiner, and others are definitely part of that too. But I find that it's best if somebody has a pretty good degree of familiarity with TMS in the first place, because I'm not a doctor, so I can't diagnose you as having TMS formally, right? So,
That makes sense. Awesome. Yeah, I'll drop a link in the show notes to that group so that people, if they're like, oh, I want to be a part of that, or they want to connect with you or have questions, they can.
yeah, yeah, and they're more than welcome to contact me directly. There are good things about the groups, about TMS groups, and there are potentially bad things about them too, in the sense that they can sort of lead to some unfortunate cycles of not the most productive conversation.
Yes, yes, I've definitely, yes, I like, one of the really most beautiful things about the program I have followed for myself is that we really try to not focus on the symptoms, and we try not to, you don't give power or energy to the symptoms.
Yep.
You're not always thinking or dwelling or talking about them or asking questions about them. And
Yep.
sometimes in these groups, it can be very triggering because it's like symptom this, symptom that, symptom this. What about this? What about that? A lot of focus can be on that sometimes. So I
Yeah.
definitely recommended some people to temporarily maybe unfollow, not leave the group, but unfollow if they're finding themselves kind of constantly triggered by seeing all the attention on symptom.
Yeah, that's something that we ran into with the group. I want to say it was almost 2 years ago, 2 3 years ago. We started seeing just a deluge of comments about symptoms. This is this TMS, is that TMS. Understandable. I get it. Like you get into this, and it's a world of confusion. But what was happening was that somebody would say like, well, I've got this symptom and I've dealt with TMS before. So do you think this is TMS too? Nobody's ever really seen it. And then somebody's like, oh, well, that sounds like completely different. And like, that's a really complex part of the body. So, gee, maybe it's not TMS. It's like, well, you don't know that.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like
yeah.
it's like none of you, you know, even if you're an MD in here, unless you've actually formally examined someone, you can't say that with any degree of confidence. So this is not a good route to be going down. Um, so the group that we've got does tend to be a little bit more direct than some of the others. There have been periods where there's been like some pretty intensely negative feedback that comes out of it. Had people call me out on a number of occasions on the forum. It's like, well, this moderator is a real jackass. I'm like, if you think that's going to throw me off, it's not. I'm probably just going to kind of revel in it, honestly. Like, I like not being for everybody. And I've seen enough groups on Facebook and online forums otherwise where they turn into these little circles where everything is hopeless because it can be sort of immediately rewarding to talk about miserable things. And, that's not good. And that's
Yeah, that
not,
doesn't lead to
uh,
healing.
it
We're,
doesn't lead to healing. So you have to make the decision. Do you want to heal? And everything that implies. If you heal, that means that you're going to wind up going about the daily realities of living, which can be boring, tedious, and depressing at times. And you know, you can avoid that too by taking another path. So it's really your call. And I want the group to be a place where for people who are intentional about healing and helping others to heal themselves. And that's tricky because you still want to give people affirmations and validation, but if it's just a never-ending stream of affirmations and validations, then nobody gets better.
right. Yeah, makes sense. Work in progress, a
Yeah.
work in progress, like all of life. My final question for you is what would be your kind of final piece of advice if you were just going to give, like, what's your number one usually go to solid piece of advice that you give to people wherever they're at in their journey?
It gets better. And yeah, I mean, it's, I want people to realize that like, it's not going to happen all at once. It's not linear. It's up and down, and you're going to get through it. And you're going to get through it because you've gotten through other things before, and that there's nothing wrong with you, and to keep that faith in yourself. Um, so it's a matter of just sort of letting go of the expectations.
Yeah. It's so good to note that you can get through this because you've gotten through other things
Yeah, you've
before.
gone through other things. So don't make this into more than what it needs to be, right? It's you can blow this up into something that just takes over your entire life, and that is not living. That is not feeling. That's something else. It's another distraction. So it gets better. It will get better. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but it will. And the more you focus on just leading the life that you want to lead, the more things just sort of fall into place, which isn't the most comfortable thing to hear. Like, it's
Yeah.
like, wait, I thought you were going to give me this reassurance. I'm like, well, I'm giving you the reassurance that it will get better. Like, I can promise you that. I just don't know by when, but it will. If you can feel better some of the time, you can feel better all of the time.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and every little moment that you do is giving hope and evidence.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I just wanted to say thank you for being on the show and just sharing your experience and the knowledge and wisdom that you've gained along the way in your journey. And, just being a part of um, giving people hope and new perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's great to do this, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right, friends, that's a wrap for the day. Thank you so much for being on this journey with me. Remember, if you have your own story that you want to share, please reach out and let's connect. And have fun confusing your brain with your non-dominant hand this week. Laugh out loud at yourself. And until next time, make this week great.